Okie dokie. Now time to put the sleeves into the armhole. Armhole is here, underarm, sleeve cap. I have it flattened out because of course it's a tube, so I can't open it out in the way that if we were using a sewing pattern we could do. So I want to find the center point at the bottom of the first batch of stitches that we bound off. And this point you might want to mark with something. We'll want to align that point with the underarm seam because we do have one in the garment. The highest point, we may want to mark that too. That should align with the shoulder seam. So here's how I do it. I'm inserting the sleeve inside of the armhole. Let's back off a little bit so you can see it better. Underarm, and I will soon pin the top edge, the top point we marked, to the shoulder seam. The sweater body is wrong side out. The sleeve is right side out, and that way it drops into the armhole and I can even it out all the way around. And here's the important point. It should even out all the way around. I should not have, when I walk around it with my fingers, big puckers or gaps or anything like that. The two pieces of fabric should lay together. If you have to ease very slightly, that's okay. If you have to do more than easing slightly, you really need to think about undoing some of this binding and redoing it so the two pieces do lay together without a lot of to-do. Here I have started my yarn, and I stitched through once and then tied the yarn tail to the working yarn. And I want to speak to you a moment about knots while I begin back stitching, which is the way I've decided to do this. I tried several seams, and back stitch is the one that produced the result that I liked. There are schools of thought, more dominant than my own, on knotting, and the dominant thought is never, never. It's practically one of the world's biggest sins. No one will ever speak to you again, and I do it all the time, and people are still speaking to me. The reason against it is that knots can make thick spots, and that there are other ways to join yarn when knitting that are more subtle. That is in fact true. I couldn't argue with that. However, in my career as a knitter and seamstress, I have mended sweater after sweater, made lots of money doing it, when people bought the idea that knots were a great sin and they shouldn't do it, and very nicely made homemade knits came apart, which got me to thinking if I was going to repair them using knots neatly, then maybe it would be just as well to start them that way. And I do. Now, I am very respectful of the knitting in terms of don't pull it tight, not overly tight anyway. You don't want to distort the fabric, you don't want to make a bump. But a knot doesn't have to do any of that if you're careful with it. And you can always weave in ends, as we've discussed, and I've shown you some. So I do not share the dominant viewpoint that no knots should ever occur. And particularly where I am seaming, I want a secure beginning and a secure end. I will tie my terminal end to my initial end and weave in both. Now, why is it called back stitch? Because I came up here, I'm backing up to go down. Let me work on that focus a little bit. Now I'm going to come up a little distance away. This piece of thread is just dying to be part of the sweater. Back up, down, a little far back, up a little farther past the working yarn. It's a very secure seam, and I am working behind this edge that we crocheted on. Darn that piece of thread, it is so persistent. but I will win in the end. Actually, I'm not sure that I do. Everywhere I go, my friends and my husband remove threads from me, and I always claim I have no idea where they came from. So we'll backstitch the seam around. Now, while I continue backstitching, let's talk for a moment about the philosophies of knitting. I am not a fan of the idea that there is only one right way. I don't actually think that God has spoken on the subject of the correct way to knit. I'd be all ears if he did, but I think the source is cultural, that around the world there are different ways. And what I show you is a combination of ways I was taught, things I have learned on my own that worked for me. I have a multicultural knitting background, have been taught more than once by people from more than one background, and done tons of research on my own. I mix my medium because I knit on looms and on needles and on knitting machines, and many of my knitting machines are not even similar to the Addy. So my background is eclectic, and I don't see any reason we cannot mix those traditions and the things we learn from different places and have good things come out of it. Occasionally people tell me my grandma taught me always to or never to, and to that I say, okay, if you are pleased with the methods you have and they aren't the same as mine, that's good. Use them, enjoy them. A lot of the people I teach have not knitted before, and knowing what works for me is really helpful to them. If you run into somebody teaching a class somewhere who thinks I'm utterly, totally wrong, that's rather opinionated, in my opinion, but she may have a good way. Nothing wrong with listening to her, too. I just don't choose to get all upset about knitting as a moral choice. Obviously, poking people with our tools is immoral. Beyond that, our method of assembling our knitting or accomplishing it seems to me to be a personal choice.